what really happened on that night in 1855? Did the storm expose a presence that had always been there? Or was the blizzard itself the prelude to a creature that had been summoned or set free to cross through England? That was the night when, according to every resident of the small villages of Devon, the devil had visited their families, homes, villages, and fields. And the events that gave rise to that belief may have been genuinely supernatural and far more macabre than you might think. That is why we at Haunted Archives went deeper into this case, determined to uncover the real story behind what many dismiss as nothing more than a macabre legend from the Victorian era. But for others, including every inhabitant of that region, it was a very real case of fear, despair, collective hysteria, doubt, and sinister entities that may still wander that land to this day. Although the macabre events had already been unfolding behind the scenes for some time, what cemented the mystery as one of the most disturbing cases of apparitions ever recorded happened during that early morning. According to local residents, Lucifer himself, in flesh and blood, had walked through England in human form, or something close to it. The tracks recorded something that had physically traveled great distances across the region, yet left behind prints resembling the hooves of goats and rams. With the spread of occultism, others came to believe it had been a manifestation of the entity known as Baphomet, known through Eliphas Levi's Hermetic writings as the Black God of the Witches' Sabbath. The most disturbing part of this entire story is that it did not happen in one isolated location, but simultaneously across a territory stretching nearly 100 miles of English countryside. According to every historical record, the tracks appeared across several different villages, including Exmouth, Lympstone, Topsham, Dawlish, Teignmouth, Torquay, and Totnes. They formed a continuous and deeply unsettling line, like a dotted line cutting across a map, as though the bipedal creature had pressed forward, crossing open ground, scaling rooftops, crossing rivers, and overcoming every obstacle in its path. According to oral accounts passed down through local generations, the prints appeared in places no ordinary animal could ever reach. In some locations, they reportedly scorched the very ground they touched. For more than 170 years, historians, archivists, and researchers of legends and the supernatural have tried to find an explanation or reduce that night to an animal, a hoax, or a natural meteorological phenomenon. But no explanation has ever accounted for every reported element at the same time. Before the hoof prints appeared, Devon had already been surrendered to a winter many would later describe as a warning. The cold itself had begun to feel almost supernatural, heavier and darker than any cold the region had known before, even the kind that rose from the black waters of the River Exe. For weeks, the snow had been closing roads, crushing crops, and isolating entire farms. Beyond that, some swore the animals had learned to remain unnaturally silent, refusing to drink or eat after sunset. When the sky darkened at first because of the snow, doors were reinforced, horses were brought inside, and children were kept close to the fire. Families avoided opening their windows once the candles began to burn low. Outside, the blizzard, far worse than usual, erased paths and swallowed sounds and voices, turning Devon into a place so isolated that anyone or anything could approach without leaving a trace. At least that had been true until that night. On the night of February 8th, the storm finally came down on the region with a violence that, according to old accounts, made even the bells of certain churches seem muffled beneath the snow. Fences vanished, trails were buried, and the fields became too smooth, too white, as though an invisible hand had wiped Devon clean to prepare the ground for a passage. The blizzard turned every village in the region into an island surrounded by white, yet it also joined the fields into one vast borderless expanse, unlike anything anyone had seen before. It was the perfect setting for a real horror film. And as the early morning began to break, Devon did not seem merely covered in snow. It seemed to be waiting for a revelation. At dawn, when the men went out to inspect fences, gather firewood, and search for missing animals, they realized the snow had preserved more than the damage caused by winter. It had preserved evidence. More precisely, it had preserved a path. And before the first mark, the residents would come to understand that Devon had not been alone that night. The first tracks were found outside homes where entire families had slept through the blizzard. There were marks near doorways, beneath windows, and beside closed fences. On some properties, the hoofprints stopped only a few steps from the entrance. Then they continued on, as if something had stood there, perfectly still, watching. Newspapers from the time described marks resembling cloven hooves, arranged in a single unbroken sequence. But the versions passed down by the residents were much worse. They were terrifyingly worse. Some said the snow around the prints had melted. Others swore that the exposed ground beneath the ice was blackened, hardened, and warm to the touch, as if a red-hot horseshoe had pressed into the earth during the night, especially when the marks appeared on wooden surfaces, porches, and rooftops. In one story, repeated through the villages near the X, the trail reached a wooden fence and continued on the other side without leaving any sign of climbing, jumping, or support. Yet on the highest plank, a dark hoofprint had been burned into the surface. The wood was not broken. It was marked the way farmers brand cattle. But there, on that fence, the marks looked like red-hot horseshoes. Men tried to explain that ice could warp wood, that the wind could carry branches, and that snow could conceal older marks. But none of those answers explained why the hoofprints always appeared in the same line, one after another. Upon closer examination, it appeared that the trail had been made using only hind hooves. No front hooves, no human footsteps, no dragging, no other trail accompanying that dark sequence. What disturbed Devon most was not the shape of the hoofprints. it was where they appeared. Some stopped in front of doors, as if the creature that had left them had entered the house. At another point along the trail, the prints passed beneath bedroom windows where children slept. In certain homes, residents found the marks ending on one side of the house and beginning again on the other, as if the creature had passed through the wall. Then they checked the rooftops, and there were the marks. Despite the sinister and disturbing nature of the event, no resident reported seeing the visiting creature. No one heard a knock, a breath, or the sound of footsteps approaching. But when morning came, it was impossible to deny what everyone could see. Goat hoof marks everywhere, forming a single trail left by a bipedal presence that did not even respect the laws of physics. What had truly visited those lands? And more importantly, why? Beyond the doorsteps, the men discovered that the hoofprints did not end at the properties. The line continued across the fields of Exmouth, Lympston, Topsham, Dawlish, Teignmouth, Torquay, and Totnes, reappearing wherever the snow still lay untouched. It did not look like a lost trail. It looked like a path laid out by something that knew exactly where it wanted to go, moving through Devon, visiting village after village, and searching for something. In the open areas, the hoofprints appeared one after another, always spaced the same distance apart, always facing the same direction. There were no signs of pursuit, rest, or flight. The account said the trail never veered off in search of shelter. It simply kept moving, as if the creature had no need to protect itself from the wind, the ice, or the night. When tall walls cut across its path, the sequence did not stop. In some versions preserved through oral tradition, the marks climbed straight up the stone, stamped vertically until they reached the top, then descended and reappeared on the other side perfectly aligned as before. There were no human footprints beside them, no traces of ladders, ropes, or jumps. There were only the two hooves, as if the wall and physics itself had never existed. The barns also became part of the legend. Farmers said that just like their homes, the roofs of the barns, despite being 3 times higher than the houses, had also been marked by that macabre and mysterious nocturnal procession. But the stretch that destroyed any attempt to reassure Devon lay along the Exe. The line of hoofprints descended to the dark edge of the estuary and vanished beneath the water. On the opposite bank, it appeared again in the same order, at the same spacing, as if something had crossed the river without sinking, swimming, or leaving behind a single sign of return. As the day went on, the men were no longer following mere prints, but a route that crossed homes, fields, walls, rooftops, and water. And when they realized the trail led to no animal at all, many stopped searching for a creature. They began searching for the name that could explain it. When the men returned from the banks of the Exe, they no longer spoke of a lost creature. Something had changed. Anyone watching could see it in the behavior of everyone who had gone to the river. They now walked cautiously, looking over their shoulders as if afraid of being overheard. even though no one understood what that behavior truly meant. That same Sunday, the small churches of rural Devon were filled far beyond what was normal. In the face of it all, the clergy found themselves pressured to give the people an answer, or at least an opinion, mainly to quiet what the newspapers of the day had been claiming about the now famous strange marks. But most unsettling of all, among the faithful, no one used that name. To them, the hooves, the bipedal line, and the impossible crossing carried a meaning too ancient to ignore, a meaning that was spreading through the rise of occultism. A meaning Reverend Musgrave himself tried to suppress in a failed attempt to calm the residents. Even so, the word devil was already passing from door to door in every local community. In oral tradition, it was that same week that the first accounts emerged of sudden, unexplained cold, of earlier sunsets that brought an unnatural darkness, even for winter, followed by temperatures rising and falling within seconds. On February 3rd, roughly a week before the storm, residents began reporting a strange and suffocating smell, similar to sulfur, yet with no apparent source. It was dry, metallic, and suffocating, at times even reminiscent of blood, only worse. They said it entered through cracks and remained in the rooms even after the windows had been opened. It was only after the early hours of February 8th that the image of Baphomet began to shape the official version of the story. A goat standing upright like a man, a figure that did not need to force open doors, because it only had to stop in front of them to be recognized. Devon never called those marks devil's footprints for lack of imagination. It did so because the signs perfectly echoed the stories that had been growing more famous in recent times. Until then, no real case had ever existed, and everything had been considered myth and folk legend. Still, all the tales revolved around hooves, horns, sulfur, silence, and a visit made in the night. That night, out of the legend already alive in stories of practical occultism, came the real case that became known as the day the devil walked across England. From that day on, much had changed in the local communities, and the story of the region would slowly spread across Europe. What would you do if your animals suddenly refused to enter the barns at night? What if the milk began turning sour before the milking had even started? What if your cattle, pigs, and sheep began falling ill without any apparent cause or explanation? Birds were found collapsed near the fences, while wild animals came into the villages as if fleeing the woods. How would you interpret all of that? The trail had vanished in many places, but something seemed to have remained around Devon after the last hoofprint was seen. The first birds began appearing near the fences. They were not wounded by hunters, nor were they covered in snow. They lay motionless, scattered in small groups, with their wings spread across the ice. Some swore they found them all facing the same direction, the fields where the hoofprints had passed during the night. In the stables, the cows refused their food, and the horses gnawed at their own ropes. Sheep pressed themselves against the walls, and kept staring at closed doors for hours. In some homes, residents began sleeping with animals inside the kitchen, believing that if they reacted first, there would still be time to shut everything down before something happened again. Oral tradition also speaks of births that should never have happened. Deformed calves, too weak to stand, lambs with clouded eyes almost lifeless, animals that did not even react to light. Small creatures were found dead before dawn, left on the straw as if something had entered the barn, remained there for a few minutes, and left without any trace other than the smell. Some people tried to cover the odor with herbs candles or holy water, but nothing worked for long. That was when the residents began watching the fields. Men took turns with lanterns, shotguns, and crucifixes, waiting to see what moved between the trees. Many returned before dawn, without firing a single shot. In an effort to help people return to their normal routines, newspapers, sermons, and conversations among educated men began offering explanations involving animals, weather phenomena, and possible hoaxes. Not because anyone had found an answer, but because an entire region needed to believe those hoofprints did not belong to the devil. The first explanation to gain traction came from Reverend G.M. Musgrave, vicar of Withycombe, Raleigh. According to him, 2 kangaroos had escaped from a private collection in Sidmouth. He claimed their leaps could have left hoof-like marks in a single line. But in every village where that theory was repeated, someone asked the same question. What animal crosses through a snowy night, stops in front of closed doors, and reappears above walls and rooftops? Then came the badgers, defended by Richard Owen, a highly respected British naturalist. He suggested that those animals could have produced at least part of the tracks because they were nocturnal and relentless in their search for food. After Owen came Thomas Fox, a respected brewer and brickmaker from Ballington. Fox sent drawings to the Illustrated London News, showing how the leaps of small rodents could create marks that genuinely resembled those prints. But when that theory was confronted with reports of tracks that appeared to burn the places where they landed, his explanation could no longer account for the rest of the case. More theories continued to emerge for a long time afterward. According to Mike Dash, a researcher who gathered some of the most important historical sources on the case, even doctors were offering their own explanations. Yet none of the hundreds of theories survived once they were measured against the full collection of facts and evidence. The last attempt was the cruelest of all, to call everything a hoax. Someone, they said, had crossed Devon during the storm, using tools, fake shoes, or some kind of metal device. But for that to be true, dozens of people would have needed to work in the snow across different villages, leaving no human footprints, never being seen, and without a single one of them ever deciding to reveal what they had done. In the end, each explanation seemed to tear away one part of the story and throw the rest into darkness. The men could debate animals, ice, balloons, and lies. But families still locked their doors before nightfall, because for those who had seen the marks outside their own homes, It did not matter what name people gave to it. The question remained the same. Why Devon? Years later, the hoofprints had vanished from the fields, the rooftops, and the doorsteps where entire families had awakened in shock that morning. And when the last mark sank into the mud, the region lost the only visible proof that something had crossed through those villages. All that remained were locked doors, silent fields, and people who swore they could hear hooves outside. So what really happened on the night of February 8th? Did the storm expose a presence that had always been there? Or was the blizzard itself the prelude to a creature that had been summoned or set free to cross through England? There is an even more disturbing possibility. Maybe the storm did not come to reveal the trail, but to hide everything else. Who knows what the blizzard concealed, masked, or erased from the face of the earth that night? Who knows whether the snowstorm itself had been summoned to cover it all up, but the malignant presence that walked through Devon left marks so deep that not even a blizzard of that magnitude could hide them completely. The question now becomes something else. What secrets were buried beneath the ice that night, in the darkest readings of ceremonial magic and hermeticism? And what if those hooves were not the path of a creature, but the final sequence of a ritual carried out across an entire region while its homes remained closed? Devon was not a blank page on the map of England. It was an ancient land, surrounded by churches, fields, estuaries, ghost stories, and a population that understood the weight of certain signs. And perhaps that is why no explanation has ever managed to kill the legend. For those residents, perhaps the horror was not inventing the devil. Perhaps it was recognizing his language. If you know of stories with questionable explanations, supernatural cases, or any kind of information that could help us improve our investigations, send it to the Haunted Archives email. Perhaps that material can help map a tradition far older than Devon and reveal cases that still go unnoticed, or even cases kept hidden from us by those who rule the shadow world.